Welcome to another webinar by REACHLaw, this time on something a bit different, and that is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, so CBAM, known also as CBAM, and commonly spoken about as CBAM. So today we have the first part of two webinars, so part one, where we focus on the basics of CBAM. So the next part two is something that's coming up on April 16th, where we'll then go into more detail on the implications depending on your role in the supply chain and more in depth in general. So today you will hear someone else speak than myself for the bulk of this presentation, and that someone is Tero Koski. Please, Tero, if you can introduce yourself to the audience, please.
Yes, hello. So my name is Tero Koski, and I'm a principal consultant here at REACHLaw, focusing on economic, social, and environmental impact assessments. And I'm an economist by training, and I have 10 years experience from regulatory compliance.
Thank you, Tero. And I'm Frederik, Johanson, partner, head of sales at REACHLaw, so a long background, actually coming up to 20 years this year in all kinds of chemical related regulatory topics, but also EHS related topics. So happy to be here and go through this very interesting topic and very topical topic also. I think many people have heard about CBAM, are wondering what that means and what are the implications on them. So try to answer those questions during this webinar series. So some practical information pertaining to the webinar. So we will be answering questions you've submitted as part of the registration process, but you can also use the chat function to submit questions that arise during the webinar. We'll try to also answer those at the end. And as per usual, we will also record this webinar. We will make this recording available on YouTube, our YouTube channel later on, within a week or so. And of course, in any case, please feel free to send us feedback. We very much appreciate all good and bad feedback. Helps us to make things better for you guys and gals, of course. So today's agenda will be quite packed, but we'll try to actually squeeze this into 45 minutes. Let's see if that will remain an effort, or will we actually make it, but I'm pretty sure less than 1 hour nonetheless. So we'll start with the normal REACHLaw and brief. Just for you who do not know us, you get a quick overview what we do, who we are, and so forth, where we operate, and more. Then Tero will take over and talk about the fundamentals of CBAM, look at the transitional phase and the definitive period, and the future outlook of CBAM, before going to the conclusions and the Q&A at the end. Or you also find our contact details at the end, of course, of this presentation. So a quick overview of REACHLaw in green color this time. So as most of you know, we are focusing a lot on chemical regulations and related implications, and helping companies to comply with these regulations for their chemical products that they place on different markets. And that's why we have these different offices around the world, head office being here in Helsinki, obviously, where we cover EU REACH and CLP related topics, as well as CBAM today. Then we'll have an office in the UK for UK REACH purposes in Manchester. Then we have a small office in Brussels for IT related topics mostly. And in Istanbul, in Turkey, we have for KKD related topics, so the Turkey REACH regulation, if you will. And our latest newcomer in the family of offices is in Seoul, in South Korea, where we provide services related to K-REACH and K-OSHA. And then we also have an office in India, where we provide services related to India BIS, for example, and so forth. India REACH is not yet in force, so that is something we do not support yet, because there's nothing to support, obviously. So for the usual support related services related to market access, services, meaning that you want to place your chemical products on certain markets, then we provide, for example, only representative services in all of these jurisdictions you saw on the map for all these regulations. And we also take care of all the regulatory dossiers, lead registrations, co-registrations, authorizations where applicable, and so forth. But we also then provide sustainability related services, and that will be the focus of today's webinar in the form of CBAM. And if we have a look at CBAM related services, so it's at this time, of course, a lot revolves around having an understanding how CBAM applies to you, your products that you may be importing into the EU. So scoping studies, preparing these readiness assessments, impact assessment pertaining to environmental and financial implications, and then of course reporting also, which is of course increasingly important, and something that Tero will touch upon in this presentation, and of course in part 2 in more detail, but also consulting, training where need be. So I mentioned in the beginning that the recording of this webinar will be made available on our YouTube channel. So that YouTube channel is called REACHLaw Talks. So please head over to that channel and feel free to subscribe and give a thumbs up for the videos if you like the content. But anyway, if you subscribe to that channel, you will be, and if you turn on the notifications, you will be notified when we upload these webinars to our YouTube channel. But you will find it there, so you can have a look at all our webinars there. And if you want to actually not just see us in virtually, but actually in person, then we are in different venues, events around the world this spring and summer, and later on in the year in India, Rubber Expo in Helsinki Chemicals Forum. We'll be at Chem Expo in India, Chem UK in Birmingham, if I recall. Yes, Birmingham. And ChemCon in Bangkok, Thailand, and ChemSpec in Düsseldorf in Germany, and then at TurkChem in Istanbul. So if you are in that neighborhood, please come and find us. We're happy to have a chat. And the customary disclaimer, of course, is that the content in this presentation is for general information purposes only, and it's not a substitute for any consultancy or technical consultancy by experts such as REACHLaw on this topic. So any action you may take based on the presentation is, of course, under your own risk and responsibility. So no representations or warranties are made with regards to the information contained in this presentation. So that's the standard disclaimer, makes our lawyers happy. And with that, we can actually delve into the details of CBAM, and I'll just terminate the video feed to save a bit of bandwidth. So Tero, please take over and let me know when to change slides.
Okay, thanks a lot, Frederik. You can change slide now. Yes, before we start, an additional disclaimer from my part. There are exemptions, sector-specific rules, different names for same operators, and so on in the CBAM. However, this presentation is focusing on the basic and general information, so some specifics may be overlooked. In addition, there are multiple specific roles and definitions within the CBAM regulation. This will be presented and assessed in the next webinar of this series in more detail. All right, let's start. What CBAM is? CBAM is a regulatory measure adopted by the European Union as part of its ambition to fight climate change and reach climate neutrality by 2050. CBAM is an environmental policy measure which complements and reinforces the existing carbon pricing mechanism in the EU, the EU ETS emission trading system. CBAM addresses the phenomenon known as carbon leakage, which corresponds to the risk that carbon cost could lead businesses to move their operations to countries with less stringent carbon pricing mechanisms, meaning that CBAM ensures that imported goods are subject to a carbon price that is equivalent to the carbon price of production in the EU. And more on this later. CBAM encourages sustainable practices to reduce carbon footprint globally. CBAM is now in so-called transitional phase, and the definite period starts in 2026. Next slide, please. For now, CBAM applies to 6 sectors: cement, electricity, fertilizers, iron and steel, aluminum, and hydrogen. These sectors are considered carbon intensive due to the significant greenhouse gas emissions associated with their production processes, the risk of carbon leakage, and the practical feasibility. These 6 sectors are key sectors in the modern society. Cement is a key building material used in construction. Electricity is vital for various industries and daily life. Fertilizers are essential for agriculture. Iron and steel are used in construction, manufacturing, and infrastructure. Aluminum is used in automotive, aerospace, and construction industries. Hydrogen is used as an energy storage and fuel source in various industries. Next slide, please. Let's move on to the scope of the CBAM then. The CBAM regulation applies only to CBAM goods originating in third countries and imported in the customs territory of the Union, marked with darker green on the slide. In principle, imports of goods from all non-EU countries are covered by the CBAM. However, certain third countries who participate in the EU ETS or have an emission trading system linked to it are excluded from the CBAM. These countries are the EFTA countries, Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, marked with lighter green on the slide. Certain CN-coded goods from the CBAM sectors fall under the scope of the regulation. CN codes of these so-called CBAM goods are given in Annex 1 to the CBAM regulation. When a CBAM good enters the territory, a CBAM certificate corresponding to the good's embedded emission is purchased by the importer. This balances the carbon cost between a non-EU and EU production, as the certificate corresponds to the carbon price in the EU ETS. The CBAM will therefore help reduce the risk of carbon leakage while encouraging producers in non-EU countries to green their production processes and also other countries to introduce carbon pricing measures. There are few exemptions as well. Goods which value does not exceed 150 euro or goods used for military activities are exempted. Next slide, please. The main stakeholders of CBAM are the European Commission, customs authorities, competent authorities, and authorized CBAM declarants. The Commission has a central role in administration of CBAM. The Commission will set the overall framework, rules, and guidelines in cooperation with the Member States and Parliament. The Commission also manages the CBAM Transitional Registry, where CBAM reports are submitted. Before the definite period, the Commission takes stock on the CBAM reports, submit, specify, and finalize the calculation methods, for example. Customs authorities are entitled to carry out checks on goods imported and ensure that the person importing the goods is an authorized CBAM declarant. Customs authorities also inform the importers of their obligations. Each EU member state has an important role in implementing CBAM. From 2025, competent authorities will be responsible for granting the authorized CBAM declarant status. from 2026, they will oversee the purchase of and surrender of CBAM certificates. Competent authorities will ensure the enforcement of the CBAM obligation and work with the Commission to ensure consistent implementation of the regulation across the EU. CBAM declarants usually refers to importers, but direct or indirect custom representatives of importers can also be declarants. For simplicity, I will refer these as the importers or declarants from now on. During the transitional period, CBAM declarants are responsible for submitting the CBAM declarations and for complying with the reporting and financial obligations. From 2026, they need to apply for authorized CBAM declarant status and provide accurate information regarding quantities, emissions, and certificates. Next slide, please. Next, I will explain which emissions are covered in the embedded emissions under CBAM. Let's start with an installation outside of the EU who is producing a CBAM good. Direct emissions refer to the greenhouse gas emissions released directly during the production at the installation level. These can be produced, for example, from combustion of fuels and the calcination process. Under CBAM, direct emissions also include emissions from the production of the heating and cooling irrespective of the location where they are produced. For example, emissions related to steam produced in another installation that is then delivered to a cement plant qualify as direct emissions. Indirect emissions next. CBAM requires the emissions resulting from the electricity consumed during the manufacturing process to be monitored and accounted for. This includes CO2 emissions associated with the production of electricity, such as from power plants. Part is precursor emissions. There are two types of CBAM goods, simple and complex ones. Simple goods are produced using input materials and fuels with zero emissions, meaning that the embedded emissions of simple CBAM goods are based entirely on the emissions occurring during their production. However, for complex goods, it's necessary to include the embedded emissions of relevant precursors themselves in the scope of CBAM if used in the production process. Relevant precursor materials refer to those raw materials used in the production of complex CBAM goods that are CBAM goods themselves. In the cement sector, a typical example for a precursor is cement clinker, which is the main constituent of Portland cement. These three emission types, direct, indirect, and precursor, together form the CBAM embedded emissions, which are to be reported for each CBAM good entering the EU territory. Next slide, please. Yes, next we will move on to the transitional phase of CBAM. Next one. These slides give you the key information of the transitional phase. The transitional phase started in October last year and will last until the end of 2025. During this period, CBAM focuses on monitoring and reporting. It does not involve any financial adjustment or the need to purchase CBAM certificates. The goal is to ensure a seamless and uninterrupted rollout of the mechanism. Importers of CBAM goods or their representatives need to submit a quarterly CBAM report outlining the embedded emissions associated with goods imported, as well as any carbon pricing due. Reporting declarants should get in touch with the national competent authority in the country where they are established to gain access to the CBAM Transitional Registry, which will be used to submit CBAM quarterly reports. Next slide, please. This slide presents the CBAM report and the operators to whom it mainly concerns. The CBAM report on the left, it should include the totality of each type of CBAM good, the actual total embedded emissions, the total indirect emissions, the carbon price due in a country of origin for the embedded emissions in the imported goods. And on the right, installation operators producing CBAM goods outside the EU have direct access to information on the emissions of their own installations. They are therefore responsible for monitoring and reporting the embedded emissions of goods they have produced and are exporting to the EU. They must also communicate to the importers the carbon price due in the production of the good within its own jurisdiction, if any. Importer in the EU request the relevant data on specific embedded emissions of the imported CBAM goods from the operators. In practice, this may involve intermediary traders. Importer is then able to submit the quarterly CBAM report to the CBAM Transitional Registry. The Commission has developed the CBAM Transitional Registry where the CBAM reports are submitted, and access to the registry should be requested through the national competent authority of the member state in which the importer is established. Next one, please. And as mentioned already, the transitional phase is ongoing at the moment and will last until 31st December 2025. During this period, the importer shall submit a CBAM report on a quarterly basis. These reports shall include the information on goods imported during the previous quarter and should not be submitted later than 1 month after the end of that quarter. The reporting calendar during the transitional period is outlined on the slide as well. And as can be seen, the first period and deadline have already passed. Next submission deadline is 13th of April. I have also marked the third deadline date, 31st of July this year. On the next slide, I will tell you why. Next, please. What happens if you do not comply with the CBAM regulation? Naturally, there are penalties from non-compliance. Reporting of embedded emissions in CBAM goods is now compulsory. Non-submission of a CBAM report within the reporting period is a violation of the implementing regulation, and non-correction of an incorrect or incomplete CBAM report is a violation. In case of a violation, reporting declarants may face penalties ranging between 10 and 50 euros per ton of unreported emissions. And to summarize, the competent authority shall apply penalties where a CBAM report is not submitted or corrected after the correction procedure is initiated. On the right side of the slide, the possible solutions for how to avoid these penalties are listed. First, of course, is to report correctly and on time. However, this may not always be possible. If a reporting declarant is unable to submit a CBAM report within the submission deadline due to technical errors, delayed submission may be requested via the CBAM Transitional Registry. After the request is made, reporting declarants have 30 days to submit their CBAM report. Now the 31st of July mentioned on the previous slide. So, in general, a CBAM report that has already been submitted may still be corrected until 2 months after the end of the reporting quarter. For the first 2 quarterly reports, a longer period for corrections is allowed up until the deadline for submitting the 3rd quarterly report. In practice, this means that the first 3 reports can be corrected until 31st of July this year. In accordance with competent authorities, no penalties will be imposed on reporting declarants who have experienced difficulties in submitting their first CBAM report. In case of a missed deadline, declarants should contact the competent authority of the member state where they are established. This is done via the CBAM Transitional Registry. The competent authority will provide the report declarant 30 days to submit the missing report. Next slide, please. At this moment, in the middle of transitional phase, the following 3 recommendations can be given to businesses dealing with CBAM. First one is to prepare. Understanding of the implication of CBAM for your sector and your supply chain is key. If you are an importer, ensure good communication with the installation operators within your supply chain so that they are able to define their installation's boundaries, production processes, and production routes, and therefore monitor and calculate the emissions. Second, familiarize yourself with the Commission's guidance material and IT tools. The material is very thorough and helps businesses to fulfill their obligations. Third, learn the EU method, which is the so-called full reporting method. During the first year, other reporting methods, such as using third country systems or reference values, can also be used, but the EU method will become mandatory. Next slide, please. So that was the transitional phase, and now we move on to the definite period and future outlook as well. Next slide. Last topic today is the definite period. The full implementation will begin from 1st of January 2026. From this point, authorized CBAM declarants will be required to purchase CBAM certificates corresponding to the embedded emissions. From 26 to 33, the embedded emissions for CBAM goods will gradually be covered by the CBAM obligation, as free allocation under the EU ETS is gradually phased out. From 2034, 100 of embedded emissions of the CBAM goods will be covered by CBAM certificates, and no free allocation will be given under the EU ETS for these goods. EU operators will pay the CO2 price of their emissions and surrender allowances under the EU ETS. And EU importers of CBAM goods into the EU will surrender CBAM certificates that closely reflect the situation of the EU ETS. Next slide, please. This slide simplifies how the EU ETS and CBAM are working together to prevent carbon leakage. Once CBAM is fully in place, together with EU ETS, it equals the carbon-related production cost between the EU and outside the EU. The cost related to the emissions of products produced in non-EU countries will be comparable to those incurred within the EU. And manufacturers and importers will be equally accountable for their carbon footprint. So, EU ETS will cover the production in the EU, as the EU producer must purchase and surrender emission allowances from the EU ETS. And CBAM will cover the production outside the EU. EU importers will buy CBAM certificates corresponding to the carbon price that would have been paid had the goods been produced under the EU's carbon pricing rules. In other words, CBAM creates a level playing field for EU and non-EU producers. Next slide, please. Next, let's move on to the CBAM principle under the definite period. CBAM certificates are the instruments that importers use to pay for the price of the embedded emissions in the imported goods. Each year from 2026, importers have to buy and surrender CBAM certificates that correspond to the embedded emissions in the imported goods. Certificates can be bought along the year, not necessarily at the time of import of goods. The price of a certificate will reflect the previous week's average auction price of EU ETS allowances expressed in euros per ton of CO2 equivalents emitted. And as no importer should be charged twice for the same emissions, importers have the opportunity to claim a reduction of the CBAM certificates up to the level of any carbon price paid in the country of production. The reduction requires importers to demonstrate that a carbon price has been effectively paid in the country of origin. Next slide, please. So, in practice, starting from January 1st, 2026, each member state's competent authority is responsible for selling CBAM certificates to authorized declarants. The Commission computes the price of CBAM certificates. The price is based on the average weekly closing price of EU ETS allowances. This means, again, that the price of CBAM certificates is linked to the market price of carbon within the EU. The Commission publishes the average price on its website. The price is applicable from the next working day until the first working day of the following calendar week. National competent authorities are obliged to repurchase excess CBAM certificates upon request by a declarant. The repurchase price for each certificate is the price paid at the time of purchase. Next one, please. All right, how does the future look like and what are the possible additions? Just to note that it is all guessing at the moment. By the end of 2025, the Commission will review the transitional period and look into the possibility of extending CBAM to other goods and sectors covered by the EU ETS at risk of carbon leakage. Political discussions seem to favor extending CBAM by 2030 to cover, for example, sectors like chemicals, polymers, paper and pulp, and mineral oil products. My recommendation for the businesses in these sectors is that to start following developments of CBAM and preparing for it. Next one. All right, now we have conclusions before questions and answers. Next one. The webinar can be summarized into 3 take-home messages. First, CBAM is an environmental policy measure which complements the EU ETS and addresses carbon leakage. Second, transitional phase. Stakeholders are practicing, currently only monitoring and reporting of embedded emissions. Companies still have time to prepare and implement best practices. Third, however, the definite period is less than 2 years away. Soon importers must pay for embedded emissions and there will be financial consequences. Also, it is good to keep in mind that the lesser emissions, the smaller the cost. Next one. Yes, and REACHLaw also supports companies with CBAM compliance. And next slide, I think we have the questions and answers.
Yes, indeed we do. Thank you, Tero. And I hope there was some audio issues during the way, but I hope you were able to, so the attendees were able, sorry, difficult language today, this English, able to listen to all and hear what Tero was saying. So I hope that's what happened for you. Okay, anyway, let's go to the Q&A. So let's first look at the pre-submitted questions. Then we have some questions that were submitted now during the webinar. And I will just, as Tero is the subject matter expert here, I will function as the narrator reading out the questions. So Tero, first question. What is the best practice for collecting CBAM data from suppliers not using an Excel file?
Yes, thank you. This refers to the Excel file provided by European Commission. And the answer to the question is that we are currently in a process of developing a tool and supporting services for this purpose with a specialist software partner. And we will share more information when available.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Tero. And indeed, you need a software to collect this information because it can be quite a lot of information. So some are reminiscent of SCIP for those who had to work with that or have to work with that. Okay, next question. How do I know if my specific product is under the scope of CBAM? And this was also a question in the chat. So two birds with one stroke in this question.
Yes, you need to compare your product's CN codes against the list of goods given in the Annex 1 to the CBAM regulation. And just to highlight that this is also a part of our scoping study service.
Yes, indeed. And if I may, I can even show what the Annex 1 of this regulation looks like. So if you see on the screen, you can see that the regulation Annex 1 lists the goods that are applicable. So cement, and here you see the CN codes. So you need to look at the CN codes. So you have the cement products, electricity, fertilizers, iron and steel. Chemicals should come up, aluminum, and chemicals, so meaning hydrogen. So this is where you would look at the CN codes. Okay, next question. What are the obligations of a contract manufacturer based outside of the EU whose products are sold into the EU? I think you covered this, but please do reiterate a bit.
Yes. So you are responsible for monitoring and reporting the embedded emissions for that product if it falls under the scope of CBAM. And additionally, you should communicate the carbon price in the country of origin. Your importer in the EU will request this information from you. If you can't give the information, your product can't be exported in the EU. And Also to note, we are helping companies setting up their monitoring and reporting practices.
Very good, thank you. And question number 4. Please inform about coming obligations for chemicals apart from iron, cement, and so forth. You also touched upon this already, but please do reiterate again.
Yes, so we predict that CBAM will be extended to the chemical sector in the future. And when this happens, the obligations will be similar than outlined in this webinar. To enter the market, CBAM certificates corresponding to embedded emissions need to be purchased. So the importers of chemicals under the scope must calculate the embedded emission and purchase CBAM certificates.
Yes, thank you, Tero. And actually, question number 5 is essentially the same, but as it's here, I'll just read it. So how will CBAM affect other sectors, such as chemicals, which we talked about? Will other sectors be included in CBAM in the upcoming years?
Yes. So as mentioned, we predict the CBAM will be extended to the chemicals in the coming years, and with the previously explained obligations. And other sectors, as mentioned, would be polymers, mineral oil products, and paper and pulp.
Indeed, very good, thank you. Then a question on cosmetics. How will an OEM cosmetics manufacturer based in Thailand be affected by CBAM?
Yes, so with the current scope of sectors, likely not affected at all. However, when chemicals and mineral oil products are added to CBAM, you should check the CN codes. If your products are then under the scope, you need to monitor and calculate the embedded emissions if you want to export to the EU.
Very good. Then there's a question on packaging. So we import packed chemical products. Are those packagings affected by CBAM?
Again, it should be checked the CN codes from the Annex 1. Chemical sector are not in the scope, and the packaging goods likely also not yet, but you should check the CN codes from the Annex 1 in the regulation.
Very good. And then looking to understand what happens after the transitional phase when actual data is required. So I guess this relates to reporting to some degree.
Yes, so the basics was covered in the presentation, and it can be summarized that after the transitional phase, you must purchase CBAM certificates corresponding to your goods' embedded emissions if you want to import them into EU.
Very good. Thank you, Tero. And then a question about the linkage with EU REACH. So what is the impact of CBAM on EU REACH regulations, or maybe products?
Yes, so,
go ahead, please.
Yes, so all I can say now is that CBAM and REACH are two separate regulations, and if you want to import in the EU, you must comply with both of them.
Indeed, yes. Okay, and the final pre-submitted question. So besides introduction, I'm interested to learn more about the expansion of CBAM here with regards to chemicals are likely to be included, and what the likely timeline of the implementation could be, and how carbon intensity will be determined. Also answered previously, but please do reiterate again.
Yes, so yes, we don't have yet like the full details of which chemicals will be included, and also not the full details how carbon intensity is determined, but those products which are at risk of carbon leakage. And timeline of the extension to chemicals is likely between 26 and 30, 2026 and 2030.
Yes. Very good. Okay, and so we take a few more questions here. One question, how does EU CBAM affect manufacturers here in the UK, but supplying products into the EU, please?
Yes, so UK is out of the scope, like in the scope, which means that UK is third country, and if you want to export into EU and your product belongs to this list of CN goods, then you are under the CBAM and you have to follow the obligations basically.
Yes, very good. Thank you, Tero. And for our UK listeners, you heard it here. First, there will be a consultation on the introduction of a UK carbon border adjustment mechanism, which has launched today, just 45 minutes ago. So you can head over to the gov.uk website and search for this. So there will be a UK CBAM entering into force apparently from 1st of January 27. So that information can then, I guess, be also used for the benefit of EU CBAM when you report already paid emissions, I presume. So, but yes. Anyway, have a look at that consultation, and things are moving ahead also in the UK. Next questions. Does it apply to alloys containing iron and steel? And this relates probably to the CN codes again, but please, Tero.
Yes, so I would check the CN codes and start from there.
Yeah, exactly. And then we had questions on chemicals. We answered those, I think, also. Let's see. Then there's a longer question. I think we answered this one. I'll take it. I think we can go a few minutes over time. So what is considered as a CBAM good that needs to be reported? Actual steel, iron, aluminum that is eventually used as a raw material in production of a product, question mark. Or is it any good imported into the EU that contains steel, iron, aluminum, and so forth? Yeah. Go ahead, Tero.
I'm not hearing so good, my connection phase, but yes, raw material, if you need to, that's the sort of precursor emissions which needs to be accounted as well. And the CBAM goods, I would again start from the CN codes and then from there define if any of these products are under the scope.
Very good, thank you. Yeah, we have some connection issues today, so let's take.
My connection is very bad.
Yep, just take one more question, Tero, if you can hear.
At the moment, I hope that you heard.
We did, so that's okay. You also have to submit. Yes, can you hear me, Tero? Okay, let's do it so that because
I didn't hear properly, but if you ask that, can I explain I cannot hear properly.
Yeah, that's fine, Tero. What we will do is we will provide some of the answers. We'll try to cover those during part 2 webinar in a few weeks, and of course you'll feel free to contact us also by email to ask additional questions, and maybe we'll even reach out to you. So thank you very much for your attention, and please feel to contact Tero and myself. And sorry for the audio issues, sometimes it happens, but we're happy that you stayed with us this long. So we wish you a very nice day, and thank you also to my colleague Tero for his presentation. So thank you everyone, and I wish you a very good day. Bye bye.